Hi guys, this video is about finding the center and the radius of a circle in general form. This is our general form of the equation of a circle, and in order to find the center and the radius, we can't use this form. We can't just look at this and see what the center and the radius are. So what we need to do is take the general form and transform it into the center radius form. This is the form that we worked with last class, where we know that the center is HK and the radius is R. So in order to do this, what we need to do is something called completing the square. And completing the square is actually a skill that you learned last year in algebra. So before we get to that, I just want to review a couple things about multiplying and factoring that we've probably forgotten since algebra. So the first thing that I want to start with is if we have x plus 3 quantities squared. If we want to multiply this through and evaluate or simplify this, then we need to understand that x plus 3 quantities squared, or any quantity squared, means we're multiplying that number by itself. So this is equivalent to x plus 3 times x plus 3. And from algebra, we know that we have to distribute. So if I multiply x times x, I'm going to get x squared. X times 3 is positive 3x. Positive 3 times x is another positive 3x, and positive 3 times positive 3 is positive 9. And if I simplify by combining like terms, I can combine these like terms. I'm going to get x squared plus 6x plus 9. Okay, let's look at one more. Let's look at y minus 2 quantities squared. So that's going to be equivalent to y minus 2 times y minus 2. Again, I'm going to distribute. I'm going to get y squared minus 2y minus 2y plus 4. And combining my like terms, I'm going to get y squared minus 2y plus 4. Just kidding, 4y plus 4. Alright, so the whole idea is that we're going to actually be starting with our perfect square trinomial, something that looks like this, and we're going to be working our way backwards to our perfect square. So a couple things that I want you guys to notice at this point. To get from this form to this form, I take my x squared here and square root it to get x. I take my 9 here and I square root 9 to get 3, and then the sign, this plus sign, matches the sign of my middle term. Okay, same idea down here. If I take my y squared and I square root it, I get y. If I take my 4 and square root it, I get 2, and then the sign, which is negative here, matches the sign of my middle term. So we also have to know that the standard form of a quadratic is a squared plus bx plus c. And so we're going to be using, again, completing the square in order to get to our perfect square here. So looking at an example of completing the square, by the way, completing the square is used to find the c term. So let's say I'm starting with something like x squared plus 8x. I need to find that third term, that's the plus c. So that's what completing the square is for. So I'm going to be completing the square to find c. So here's what we need to do. We have x squared plus 8x. Now 8, this positive 8 is my b term. So in order to complete the square, I need to take my b term, divide by 2, and square it. So I'm going to take my b, divide by 2, and square it. In this case, my b is a positive 8 divided by 2 squared is equal to 8 divided by 2 is 4, 4 squared is 16. And so I'm going to have x squared plus 8x plus 16. So 16 is my c term. And now I have that perfect square trinomial that I can factor. And when I factor this, again, I'm going to take my x squared and square root it to get x. I'm going to take my 16 and square root it to get 4. And then the sign here is going to be, is going to match the sign of that middle term, so that's going to be positive. And so that is squared. All right, one more example. Let's say I start with y squared minus 6x. So again, I want to complete the square to find that third term so that I can factor into a perfect square. So what I'm going to do is take my b term, remember it's b divided by 2 squared. So my b term in this case is negative 6. So I'm going to take my negative 6 divided by 2 and square it. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. Negative 3 squared is 9. And so I'm going to go ahead and add that as my c term. So I have y squared minus 6x plus 9. Now to factor that, again, my first term is going to be from my y squared. Square root of y squared is y. My 9, square root of 9 is 3. And my sign comes from the sign of that middle number. This is coming down here. So I have y minus 3 quantities squared. So again, I'm going kind of backwards to get to my perfect square. All right, so let's take a look back at our purple sheet, our purple reference sheet, and look at this example together. So the first thing that we need to do is, and essentially what we need to understand is that we're going to be completing the square twice in order to get our general form into the center radius form. So I'm going to complete the square once for my x, and I'm going to complete the square once for my y. So what I need to do in my first step is two things. The first thing is that I need to get all of my terms with variables on the left side of the equation, and I need to get all of my terms with constants on the right side of my equation. And a constant is a number without a variable. So my constant here is that negative 10. So I'm going to move my variable term over to the left. I'm going to move my constant over to the right. Remember that when we are moving terms from one side of the equation to the other, we essentially just change their sign. So my negative 10x is going to become a positive 10x, and my negative 10 here, moving it to the other side, is going to be a positive 10. Now at the same time, I also want to group all of my x terms together and all of my y terms together. So what I'm going to have as my first step is x squared. Bringing this negative 10x to the left side of the equation is going to make it a positive 10x. And then I'm going to put my y terms. So I'm going to have a positive y squared minus a 2y. And then I'm going to bring the constant to the right side of the equation. So my negative 10 becomes a positive 10. So at this point, again, I have to understand that I'm completing the square twice. So once for my x's, so I'm going to focus here for my first completing the square, and then once for my y's. So here for my y's. Okay, so again, in order to complete the square, I need to do b divided by 2 quantities squared. So over here for my x completing the square, my b term is a positive 10. So positive 10 divided by 2 squared. 10 divided by 2 is 5. 5 squared is 25. For y, my b term is a negative 2. So I have a negative 2 divided by 2 squared is equal to negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Squared is positive 1. And then I'm going to rewrite this equation, and I'm going to fill in those c terms. So the 25 goes with this, the 1 goes with this. So I'm going to have x squared plus 10x plus 25 plus y squared minus 2y plus 1 equals 10. So again, I'm just kind of highlighting here to show what I'm kind of grouping together. So the pink here is my x trinomial. The orange is my y trinomial. And again, that's a minus 2 right there. Okay, so what I did essentially is add two numbers to the left side of my equation, but I have to keep my equation balanced. So if I add 25 to the left side of my equation, I have to add 25 to the right side of my equation. And if I add 1 to the left side of my equation, I have to add 1 to the right side of my equation to keep it balanced. So now what I'm going to do is factor each of my trinomials, and what we're going to have is our perfect square plus another perfect square is equal to, and the right side is really easy to evaluate. 10 plus 25 plus 1 is just 36. All right, so again, square root of x squared is x. Square root of 25 is 5. And my sign comes from that middle term. So that positive 10x tells me this is going to be a plus. Over here, square root of y squared is y. Square root of 1 is 1. And my middle term is negative, so I'm going to bring down that minus sign. Now I have my equation in center radius form. One thing to keep in mind is that my equation always has to be equal to a positive number here. It doesn't have to be a perfect square, but this does have to be a positive number. And so if you get a positive number at this point, you need to be checking your work. Now this is our center radius form. This is what we're used to dealing with from last time. And again, I can just kind of color code that through the whole problem to help us see what we did. You don't have to do this every time. This is just to help kind of organize this first example. So remember, the whole point in doing this was to find the center and the radius of the circle. And this is just what we did last time. So our center and our radius. Our center, remember this is x, this is actually x minus negative 5. So my h is a negative 5. Y minus a positive 1. So I have a positive 1 here. My center is negative 5, 1. My radius, remember that the equation is equal to your radius squared. If r squared is equal to 36, then to solve for r, I need to square root both sides, and I get r equals 6. So my radius is 6. And there it is.